this Chinese privacy law seems to be picking up steam a little bit and getting, I don't think as much coverage as it probably deserves. But on one hand, some might consider China to come up with data privacy laws to be a little bit also ironic, given government surveillance and control is essentially the Chinese Communist Party's like MO. But I guess. Did you guys understand the differentiation between like private company collection versus state collection and how they kind of vary?
I called this out because it was out of the Wall Street Journal, just to kind of set the stage for that. It seems like at least the distinction that's being made by this particular this analyst, China, the government is aligning itself with consumers to fight data theft and privacy, whereas they're saying in Europe and the U.S. policies, it's more aligned with protection from private companies. I don't know. It's such a unique kind of discussion because when you think of China, the last thing you think of is privacies and freedoms for the most part. But in this instance, when it comes to data, they're making a compelling case. Now, I'll turn it over to you for a second, Raju, but I also want to just point out, Beijing is expected to maintain broad access over that data. So you're protecting the data from companies, but then the data is pretty much going to be in the hands of the government. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword, so to speak, at least from my perspective, a little bit.
In a lot of countries, the government knows more about the individual than private companies. And I think that is the case in majority of the countries. And in US, the private companies know more about it. Part of the reason is the government allowed monopolies to thrive, monopolies, duopolies, and all of that. And that is the pushback that we are seeing, where now FTC is trying to fight back and correct some of the mistakes that they have done in the past. And because the private companies gone too far, and the incentives of the private companies are not always aligned because they are supposed to be a profit-generating machine, and that is not always aligned with people's intentions. And the pushback will not go to the private companies, then it will come back to governments and say, why did you allow this merger in the first place? The Giphy thing is another similar example. There is a pushback there because they say it shouldn't be possible in the first place. And what China is doing, at least looking at all these recent moves they made against tech companies, what I see is China is cracking down on these tech companies and preventing them from becoming monopolies, and which US did not do, but China is doing that. I think that is what's happening. And will Chinese government, will they have access to all this information? Yes, just like many other governments out there. And again, when you're living under a certain law, you basically take a few things, you give up some information, whether it is US or a China or a India or a UK. People move to countries where they are comfortable with the local laws. If they are not, they'll just vote with their feet. They just walk out and move to a different country. In this case, China basically said we're not gonna allow monopolies in the country, and they're gonna have a firm hold. I think that's how I'm interpreting not just this move, but a series of moves they made. Be it the move on education, be it a crackdown on their financial Alipay or all other financial institutions. All of them follow the same trend where they are basically doing the work that FTC did not do in US.
Yeah, I think one thing that you said that just hit me really hard was, the monopoly duopoly conversation, right? At the end of the day, if the government is sucking up all the information from all private companies, essentially, then it's in their best interest to have that information at the private level be as fragmented as possible, and then they aggregate it at the government level, right? Why let a private company aggregate, a lot of different pieces of information at that point? Because that makes the private company too powerful. Instead, we're just going to cripple the private companies, keep it, as spread and as many competitors in whatever tech areas that they can. And at the end of the day, it'll all roll up to the government, and the government will still get everything they want with just less big companies to deal with or PR issues or anything like that, right? So government wins, and in the farce of customer privacy, but it's not really much like that, right?
Yeah, I think in US in particular, when certainly government can get this information from private companies, and that is part of the reason why we haven't seen any strict privacy laws. Well, the majority of the companies are here in US, so which means there is an incentive, financial incentive for to not do that, right? Then if you look at all these monopolies, duopolies, they are not just monopolies and duopolies in US. They are globally they are, and that is the reason some of the other countries and the local governments are adopting it, because their citizen information is being collected and pushed elsewhere, and they are the ones who are being proactive and rolling out these laws. I think this is the virtual walls are gonna go up between countries because of the abuse that's going on in the system currently.
I think this is going to be a deeper discussion. We could do like a whole series of shows on this, I think, because it's the philosophies of governments and companies and consumers, and depending on what your government structure is and your approach, you may find it much easier to roll out privacy. In the States, is we already know it's going to be a big battle. It's already a big battle because you got federal and you got state, and we're more driven by like states' rights to a certain extent, whereas China, of course, is very centralized power of from a federal government perspective. They can push down things and have them go into effect much more quickly. The other end of that, though, is then they have control over all of the data to a certain extent, versus here where, like Raju said, the data is in the hands of the corporations right now. Is there a right answer to either approach, or is there something in the middle? We could talk about this forever, and I think we'll be dealing with this for a long time to come.
There is another aspect, Brent, where a developing country versus a developed country. In a developing country, you'll notice that the government works very closely with the entities, the large corporations out there. We have seen that in say Taiwan. We have seen that in Korea. We have seen that in Japan. We have seen that in UK. If you go back to 1800s. So historically speaking, the governments work with the larger entities when they're in a developing mode. In a developed country now that is established and that goes there, and US is a developed country, so that's another reason we have seen that transition. There is that angle to it from a broader economic point of view.
Yeah, and I would say in this country, big companies tell the governments what to do. We're more established, of course. I mean, longer, but big companies basically kind of run things here until they run amok, and then they have to be pulled back. I mean, we're going all the way back to like the Sherman Antitrust Act, the 1890 or thereabouts, where Standard Oil had 90% of the game when it came to oil and fuel, and got so big that they had to be broken up. But it takes a lot to get to that point here. But I think it's really interesting what you point out around the developing countries, and they kind of collaborate. It seems like more effectively with, let's say, the fast startups that have potential game changing business models or technologies, and the government may, in these emerging countries, seem to work hand in hand with them more than here. It's like our big companies have been bossing, running things for a while until they get to the point where everybody feels like they have to be stopped before it gets out of hand. And it always has to get to that tipping point, it seems like, here in the States.